Hey there, stranger. Would you like to stay in my cabin for the weekend? I'll give you the keys, let you invite your friends over. You can even drink from my liquor cabinet. That would help you drown out the pain. Oh, and turn on some music too, because the screaming coming from the forest at night can be quite irritating. But don't worry about all that. Enjoy the cabin and have a fun last weekend. These are allegedly real and terrifying cabin in the woods stories. If you want to share your story with us, send it over at reddit.com/r/darknessprevails. These stories will be separated into different uploads, so be on the lookout for each of them. There's 3 altogether today. I hope you like them. I'm testing the waters with different upload styles, especially on Friday, which is my worst day for views. Anyway, here's the first story. Grandpa's Best Friend, from Mythology Loves Horror. The hunting cabin was just as I remembered it. It was tiny, hardly bigger than a tool shed, and after a year of neglect, dust now coated every surface. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years, not since the last time I went hunting with my grandfather Sebastian. I'd been so terrified by the thing we saw in the woods there that I hadn't wanted to return, and my parents just assumed I was too bored to want to spend 2 weeks with the boring old man. But Gramps still came to visit us. Thankfully, we never went there. When Gramps passed away a year ago, he left the cabin and the 30 acres surrounding it to his only remaining grandchild. At 20 years old, I had never expected to set foot on the rural mountainside again, much less inherit it. But a bad breakup had left me with the decision of moving into the cabin or into my parents' basement. The choice had almost been hard to make. The local newspaper, the Village Times, had claimed that Gramps died of a bear attack while out chopping firewood behind his cabin. I didn't really buy that story though, and even as I pulled my beat-up old Ford into the unpaved driveway, I had my hand on my rifle. Though if that thing came back, I was sure it wouldn't do much to it. But still, it made me feel better. I hadn't seen it in a decade, but if that creature was still out there, I would be prepared this time. At least I hoped. Several hours later, I was unpacked, and the cabin was decently clean. All of the utilities were still hooked up, and the refrigerator was well stocked. I had taken the week off of work to adjust to my new life, and I was planning on just relaxing for the next few days. My first night and day passed uneventfully, but by the second night, things were getting a little weird. I had spent enough time in the country as a child to be familiar with the wildlife here. Raccoons, skunks, bears, other mammals. But the freshly made claw marks on the side of the cabin, they weren't anything that I recognized. I woke up on my 3rd morning to gouges in the wood, and I was definitely unnerved. They were too large to belong to any small critters, and far too high up to be from coyotes. They were even too wide to be a mountain lion or bear. In this neck of the woods, that ruled out everything logical. As I studied the claw marks, I wondered how I could have slept through them being made. They definitely hadn't been there when I first arrived, and the fresh marks stood out in a bright contrast to the weathered wood of the cabin walls. I supposed a human could have made them with a knife, but I didn't have neighbors for miles. Who would be skulking around out here just to prank me like this? It didn't make any sense. It crossed my mind that maybe my ex might have done it, just to freak me out. But Sandra lived almost 50 miles away and did not have the address for the cabin in the first place. I don't use social media enough to bother listing my new address, and we didn't have friends in common or anything like that. I eventually shrugged it off, deciding to let it go. I knew that worrying about it wouldn't help. That afternoon, though, I found myself driving the 10 miles into town and buying some motion-activated floodlights and a motion-sensing camera. 2 more nights passed, and each morning, I woke up to the claw marks getting closer and closer to the cabin door. As much as I wanted to believe it was a prank, I had to admit to myself that the evidence was overwhelmingly against that idea. The floodlights would turn on, and the camera would snap, yet somehow, all I would ever see in the photos was an empty yard. I had even tried to set up a video on my phone, but all it managed to capture was a vague blur of movement at the edge of the screen. I had enough. On the 5th night, I went outside, rifle in hand, settling comfortably on the porch steps. There was no noise, no sound to indicate that the usual nocturnal critters were up and about. I shut all the lights off and waited for the creature that I knew would come. Hours passed, and as 1 a.m. rolled around, I snapped myself out of a doze. I could hear something moving quietly out by the edge of the woods, where I could make out a figure skulking about, its features hidden in the shadows. As the animal drew closer, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief, because there stood Sebastian, my supposedly dead grandpa. He wasn't wearing any clothes. He paused mid-step, his head slowly turning to face me, probably hearing me gasp from shock. Grandpa looked sickly, with skin pale and ribs visible. He was bald now, his once Santa-like beard and hair gone. "Grandpa?" I called out. I could hear the quiver in my own voice, and my hands were shaking from terror. The rifle had fallen to my lap, nearly forgotten in the intensity of seeing my presumably dead grandfather. I'd been so convinced that what I was about to see would be that antlered creature that I saw years ago, the one I knew killed Sebastian. But I never considered once that my grandpa was still alive. "Grandpa, what are you doing? Come inside." Tears were streaming down my cheeks. I didn't care what my grandfather had been doing this whole time or why he was out there. All I cared about was that he was still alive. I wanted to hug him again.
Run, you stupid boy. It's coming."
His voice barely sounded human anymore. His voice came out all wrong, and before I could respond, Grandpa was bounding into the woods on all fours. He was gone in the blink of an eye, the bushes hardly swaying where he had passed through. The woods remained as eerily silent as they had been before, even though my grandfather's retreat should have made a large amount of noise. Not a second later, a low growl came from behind me, the sound reverberating off the cabin walls. A massive creature, the one that I remembered, approached from the side of the cabin. Within seconds, it became clear to me that it wasn't a human or an animal, unless someone was wearing an amazing and terrifying costume. The creature was every bit as surreal as I remembered. Long, pale limbs sprouted from an emaciated torso. An ivory deer skull shined in what little moonlight managed to bleed out through the clouds. It was wearing ragged old buckskin leggings and had beads around its neck. I could not see its eyes though, but I knew without a doubt that if it had any, it was staring directly at me. I knew not whether it was a Wendigo or a Skinwalker or something else, but it didn't matter. It was here. Before I could take in any more detail, the creature began to laugh, a guttural sound that echoed in my head hauntingly. It was laughing so hard at me that it nearly doubled over. I realized that its limbs were able to wrap around its body almost twice. I raised my rifle, firing several times at it point blank, all of those rounds lodging firmly into the creature's neck and torso. The being looked down at its new piercings. Then, without a problem, almost comfortably, it began to dig out the bullets at an unhurried pace. It dropped them onto the ground like a child plucking flower petals. and it seemed to sigh in irritation as it dug out the final one.
Pointless.
It just spoke. What was going on? What did this thing want? Did Grandpa always know about this horrendous-looking thing? My head began to ache with the strain of trying to understand all this. It seemed to sigh as if annoyed by the bullets. It then lifted its claw and pointed it at the cabin.
Inside. Go.
I was all I could get out in reply to this thing speaking to me. I blinked profusely, and the next thing I knew, the monster was gone, and standing there was Rufus, my Grandpa Sebastian's best friend. Rufus had been around as long as I could remember, and had always been a kind old man. He supposedly lived on the other side of the mountain, even though I'd never actually seen his house, let alone been to it. Rufus just always sort of appeared out of nowhere, often startling us so badly that we had almost shot him a few times.
What in tarnation you doing out here, whippersnapper?
Rufus? Am I dreaming?
Nah, you're not dreaming. But you need to get inside before that thing comes back. That thing that looks like your grandpappy.
I was shaking so tremendously from fear that I could barely move my limbs at the time, but I managed to navigate the steps. I'm not entirely sure why I obeyed Rufus after seeing that thing, but after seeing Rufus's familiar face, there was something calming about it, making this insane situation more easily dealt with. I needed some semblance of normalcy in that moment, so I went about my usual pre-bed routine, ignoring the fact that nothing made sense anymore. Mindlessly, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked. I took a long hot shower to relax myself. I crawled into bed, my adrenaline finally calming down. I think I was in shock. I noticed I was repeatedly reassuring myself that I would wake up and everything would be as it should be. Just writing this down was hard enough. I have no idea, no ounce of understanding for what went on that night at the cabin. I'm more confused than I ever thought possible. Who really was Rufus? And what was that thing that looked like my grandpa?